Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order has a ridiculously long name, and when the game released back in 2019, I can genuinely say that was my biggest criticism. Flash forward to today, and I've finally done a replay primarily on my Xbox Series S, but footage will be captured for this video on PC. Surprisingly to me, Fallen Order doesn't quite hold up as well as I thought it would under a more critical lens. My name is fallinghurts, and here I review some small, medium, and even large games, along with news and a side of podcasts. So consider subscribing if that's what you're into, but as we hop into this video, I want to break down into my usual core 4 categories: the story, the gameplay, the visuals, and of course the audio. And if you disagree with anything I say, feel free to follow me on Twitter at fallinghurts1, and with that being said, no more shameless promotion. Now, as we hop into the story, I want to say that this will still be a primarily spoiler-free talk. With the sequel having just came out this year, I don't want to go over any major story moments, but there's going to be some early game cutscenes, and also most of the planets in the game will be shown for some degree, but without most of their story context. Anyways, Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order. Separate these 3 tags and you get all of your key story points. You play as a Jedi, Cal Kestis, who is attempting to rebuild the Jedi Order, and in doing so he puts himself at odds, or at war, with the Empire. Now, off the bat, Cal is introduced as a young Jedi in hiding who, after a brief run-in with the primary antagonists, the Inquisitors, he is thrust into a noble quest for the survival of more than just himself. Accompanying him are Seer, a former Jedi Master, and Grease, a gambling jokebox who likes to collect plants and fly ships. Also joining Cal is BD-1, a droid left behind to help us on our mission. For right now, just know that this is my favorite droid in at least modern Star Wars, as he's very emotive and empathetic without ever speaking a language that I can comprehend. There are a few other characters that I won't spoil, but really what I wanted to touch on was that there are great performances of grief, sadness, genuine joy, and my personal favorites of hatred and anger. And as that's from both friends and foes within the game, it's truly a well-casted and choreographed story presentation. Speaking of foes, however, we have the second sister, who is a super compelling villain. She's not as present as I'd like her to be, but she does all of her own dirty work, has a great backstory that eventually gets delivered fully, and most importantly, she's fun to interact with, in every way from constant fighting to dialogue. It's all really entertaining. The story itself is super personal, with a tight cast mostly. There's only really a few instances where there's larger groups of non-enemies, and it's quite brief. To me, this strikes me as a huge negative when it comes to looking at Star Wars as a property. You want the good guys to help the group of downtrodden, and eventually that helps the hero's journey in the end. While this is kind of present on Kashyyyk with the rebels, there's no clear sense of camaraderie with anyone there at all. In a lot of ways throughout this review, I will mention that Fallen Order suffers because it's a Star Wars game. One of those is because locations and story moments provided during this are almost entirely replicated during the Obi-Wan miniseries that has came out since then. Which, as someone who is finding less joy in Star Wars overall, it definitely makes Cal's story feel a little less special this time around, seeing as how somebody decided they needed to redo it for the TV at least. Of course, the journey itself is not without flaws either. Fallen Order does have some really compelling plot devices. The use of flashbacks to tie into Cal's character growth while also acting as tutorials is honestly an incredible decision. These are paced well and never feel too out of place. However, there are times when the game's pacing can be broken. The player has the ability to visit and revisit planets whenever they choose. And when the first fork in the road to Zeffo or Dathomir arrives, I chose Dathomir in 2019. This time I chose Zeffo and continued on to Kashyyyk after the story permitted, and ignored Dathomir pretty much until there was nothing else to do. Mind you, the story made complete sense to me bouncing around between Zeffo and Kashyyyk up till that point. But once I moved on, it really felt like I plowed through all of Dathomir's content at once, not limited by any force abilities that I needed to remember or story moments until the very end. This, in my opinion, doesn't allow the player to truly digest the plot that's unfolding on the ferocious planet. As I progressed through the content on Dathomir, I couldn't help but feel that every moment was falling flat, or I straight up just didn't care. And it was so interesting that it never bothered me in that way in 2019, with the initial route that I chose of bouncing back and forth. And with pacing still in mind, not to mention that there's a small section in the middle of the game when you're kidnapped by some gamblers, and this part of the game feels so out of place compared to everything else, and I honestly just hate this. We didn't even fight new enemies or anything, it's just a different location. And I've used broad strokes, but I hope that I've illustrated and made clear that the characters of Fallen Order are superb, and it makes it all the more unfortunate when the pacing can betray any relevance that they have in the player's eyes. The direct story isn't the only issue I had though. The Force Echoes collectibles, where you get little audio snippets and a quick little codex entry when you find them, are really great in concept and a cool contextualization of this Force ability that Cal has, but when you begin finding a string of these collectibles in the wrong order, their presented story can be a little bit disorienting. Not to mention that no one in their right mind wants to stop an action game to read about some small world building that isn't even relevant to the game, let alone the greater canon. Once again, follow me on Twitter if you want to say something about that. But that's how I feel in this instance. And while I've mentioned many negatives here, I have to at the very least say that I remain firm that the actual plot is pretty good. A decent runtime full of small, beautiful moments and crazy big ones, all held within the lens of a galaxy far, far away. Meaningful character development from most characters really seals the deal that this is a great Star Wars story of fantastical locations and the moral battles that take place within them. Ultimately, this game cemented Cal as a character that I really wanted to see again, and of course we did in the sequel that I'm really excited to play, and I haven't yet, so no spoilers, I guess? Please? But speaking of play, let's actually talk about the gameplay. Here, I'm mostly positive of what there is, but generally, I just wished for more. That's once again something I'm hoping the sequel is going to rectify in some way. With that, Fallen Order features a third-person action combat similar in essence to a FromSoft game. However, instead of the usual inspirations, it was a little more progressive in that Fallen Order features an emphasis on perfect blocking and parrying to break down an enemy's stance, which is mostly prominent in Sekiro, a game that released the same year as Fallen Order. Clearly this wasn't a copy of any kind, but rather that both Respawn and From Software kind of tapped into the same goldmine and zeitgeist at the exact same time, or at least fairly close to it. It's even more interesting at the fact that this game apparently started out as something that wasn't even Star Wars, but when they got the rights to do Star Wars, that's something that they were able to reshape the story into. Now, I love how the lightsaber feels in this game. It's brutal and can one-hit a lot of human enemies. Then there's the creatures and droids that tank some extra hits, and that still makes perfect sense. Where my issue comes in is that there are some human enemies like the Stormtrooper Commandos and the higher-ups that take more than just one hit to actually kill them, and it really feels like it's because they needed a harder enemy that you actually have to parry against. Again, with the droids and the creatures, this is perfectly fine, but for the people, the ones that, at the very least aren't the ones super trained for this, to me it didn't make a lot of sense. And like I said, the game actually has a good answer for the human enemies that you need to face that aren't, Sith Lords, in the form of the Purge Troopers. Mini-boss styled enemies that are truly visually and mechanically distinct from all the others. Where I would normally recommend simply leaning into numbers of enemies rather than the difficulty of basic enemies, I really do love how the Purge Troopers are balanced and placed throughout the levels. I think it just makes perfect sense, and I really loved every time I faced them. But speaking of the bosses themselves, the fights are some of the coolest in the game for me. Well, when of course they are against a lightsaber user. There's a clear bar of quality and care for each of the saber combatants, as these enemies use the Force and their weapon in unique ways to keep the player on their toes. Each fight also builds on the mechanics of the last, which always is a plus. Their rarity in the story only makes them taste sweeter when you actually get to them. On the flip side, the other boss fights are just okay. I don't really like the idea of the recolored animal variants with more health, and it's not just because I'm picky, but because most planets only have like 4 to 6 types of creatures. And now you can probably count on making 2 of those into boss fights with slightly different color variants, and you've pretty much ruined any sense of wonder that you have. Now, I briefly mentioned the Force earlier. In combat, it's cool. You charge your Force meter by dealing damage, and Cal can pull, push, and slow enemies. And with certain upgrades in the skill tree, you can do so quite efficiently if I do say so. Now, the skill tree itself is okay. Nothing amazing, as the abilities you unlock are pretty standard, though I can definitely praise the game on not allowing me to upgrade my lightsaber damage more than just the one time. My biggest issue with the skill tree isn't about the skills themselves, but rather how you collect and store the experience. Fallen Order falls into the Souls-like category in a few ways. So by default, we need some bonfires and routes of enemies to a boss that can be mastered and manipulated by way of shortcuts. This is all present here, along with other caveats with them. Where my issue comes in is that with Dark Souls, you could argue that the protagonist is in a purgatory-like state. simply trying to achieve its destiny and full potential. Here, it doesn't make sense for you to kill the same stormtroopers over and over again. Creatures could be fixed by simply having a few different randomly chosen spawn points that they could be from each time, giving the illusion that no matter how many ways you approach it, there could be just different animals coming through the area. Though the stormtroopers throughout the story should stay relatively limited in my eyes. I wish that Fallen Order could have been a semi-linear narrative game, free of those Souls-like trappings, as it takes away from my immersion. To really twist the knife in, the XP you collect normally doesn't really require any farming or grinding to get most of the upgrades, so we really didn't need the ability to reset enemies at will, rather than a checkpoint on death or something like that. Now, circling back, the Force also helps with other aspects of the gameplay, and that's the platforming. Whether you're slowing down a fan to run across, force pulling a hanging vine to swing on, or pushing down a bridge to close the gap, there's always a use other than just combat, and that just barely scratches the surface. The game does a great job of making you use many abilities in a quick succession in order to advance as well, combining many of the things I've already mentioned in a way to clear larger gaps. Unfortunately, my love for the platforming ends there. While there are other cool aspects like jumping and soaring into air vents, you always run the risk of the player snapping failing so badly that you won't even initiate the wall run that you're right next to, the ledge grab, or the vine swing that you were counting on to not fall to your death. And you, of course, know what they say about falling. It hurts. As I look back, I see some of the shortcomings with the core gameplay loop, but the individual poles are still able to hold up the tent even if it is ripped on the top. As far as gameplay is concerned, seemingly small things like rough platforming and narrative dissonance come off as extra annoying because I know how bright certain aspects of the game really do shine. But it's not all blue milk and banthas. There's also a Padme every once in a while, if you will. As we discussed the last major bit of gameplay, I want to shift to the visual design, as I believe it ties in really well here. And finally, Fallen Order is a pretty by-the-numbers Metroidvania. Now, before some pleb comes in and says, "It's not 2D," well, shut up. The game features a need to retrace your steps in certain locations once you've found a certain upgrade, a force ability, and that's required for your progress and even finding collectibles. Now, how this ties into visuals for me is that as you move from location to location, planet to planet, you're going to experience a myriad of flora and fauna from a wide variety of landscapes and color palettes that all feel like the highest quality as possible. You know, except for the Wookiees. You know what? Fuck the Wookiees. In general, they are ugly in everything. Chewbacca doesn't even look good, but as a society, it's taken up to 40 years to accept him as fine. But the ones here in this game are especially egregious. Like, what is that? Another thing, when you're trying to find your way forward, or mostly a collectible, good luck. The map is so bad and disorienting, they want it to be Metroid Prime so bad, but you just aren't her, Respawn. I'm sorry. And as for the collectibles, you better hope it isn't another goddamn poncho, because god fucking damn, the ponchos are the most boring collectible you can ever find, and that's even more boring than some of the text things that I didn't even read. Truly though, the Metroidvania elements are justified and satisfying. The story demands returns to certain planets, and when you get there, you see a whole new route of possibilities with your upgrades. It's this layered approach that feels congruent in story, gameplay, and even visuals, and that's something that I can't get out of my head even today. However, my thoughts on the visuals aren't over. Otherwise, technically, the game is a little all over the place. There are some scenes of dialogue that don't match as soon as you actually leave, say, the ship or something where you were having this dialogue on the planet. Throw in stuff like sporadic frame rates in larger sections, and this makes this experience a little more tough to witness at times. Oh, and the load times can be terrible even on an SSD, but it was rare enough that I can't even say it changed my view, because at the end of the day, this is one of my favorite pieces of Star Wars, all issues considered. Okay, now that I've gotten all of that out of my system, I have some other highs and lows, visually speaking, that I really need to finish with. Firstly, combat. The particles of the lightsaber slashing through things looks great. My only minor criticism is that there isn't any human dismemberment with the most iconic weapon in pop culture. We'll see if Survivor rectifies this, and of course the internet probably already knows. The animations are damn near perfect as well. There's the occasional stuttered run animation or hitch while moving around the world, but when the combat hits, the swings and projectiles are pixel perfect. allowing for a great sense of mastery as you crank the difficulty as well, which to my absolute delight simply adjusts the size of your windows for timing rather than enemy health or things like that. The animations are also utilized by those fake loading screen shuffles through the walls, and it actually makes it kind of fun to watch. There's a lot of very different ones here where Cal will kind of jump up or down or different things like that. It's not so boring as, like, I don't know, God of War. But in that way, you can definitely feel, even on, current gen, that this is a previous gen title in a lot of ways. But as I want to finish with the visuals, I want to stress authenticity. Not of a Respawn game with first-person shooting, but that of a Star Wars game. The charm of Star Wars, from the George Lucas scene transitions to the cinematic planet and ship shots, all the way down to the small details and buttons in a cockpit or on a stormtrooper's armor, there's so much great Star Wars in this game. We see new planets and we see returning ones. Regardless, all are shown with the utmost care and fit beautifully into this space adventure. But that authenticity isn't just present visually, as the audio in the game is a nerd's wet dream. That makes me feel gross. From the hum and spark of a lightsaber, firing of a blaster, or any of one of the many vehicles powering up, or some of the ancient alien dialect, there's a myriad of ways to appreciate the sound. But for me, the most evident is the music. It's unapologetically inspired by the source material and elevates and adds themes and motifs for new characters like Cal or even Trilla. Matter of fact, my favorite pieces were actually from Trilla's, as the unrelenting chords crescendo in parallel to your encounters with the second sister, which is the opposite of most of the inspiring and whimsical orchestral music that fills the rest of the voyage. In the same vein, we have the characters' voices. Every character feels perfect within the universe. The wide range of emotions I mentioned earlier are fully carried out by their actors, from Cameron all the way down to the stormtrooper who sounds just muffled enough to be cannon fodder. Also, the dialogue from the soldiers is so funny, especially when compared to the terrifying shrieks of giant spiders and weird slugs. It's an interesting juxtaposition in the forests of Kashyyyk. At the end of the day, the sound was never what took me out of the experience here. It's authentic and far above serviceable as far as the quality is concerned. And with that being said, I'd like to waste no time and get into my final verdict. In 2023, Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order is overall lesser than I remembered. Sure, there are things that have aged well. The top-notch sound design and distinct and varied visuals are just as amazing as I remember them. Though I admit that in a more critical lens, this game seems less and less stable, with inconsistent frame rates and even climbing and jumping hitch points. Smaller issues aside, where I believe the game really falls apart for me is the story presentation. The structure of the story makes pacing feel poor at times, and I don't think that the Souls-like gameplay loop benefits the narrative in any way. Thankfully, the characters introduced are all impactful and most importantly entertaining, and compounded with the striking visuals and an authentic soundtrack, you've got a Star Wars story that is well worth your time, money, and your investment for the sequel. But really, that's it for me. I'm not sure what this is going to get edited down to in size, but I think with this, I'm pretty comfortable saying that I don't need to play this game for a while. I'll probably play the sequel, Survivor, as soon as I'm done with this review, and then continue on to whatever the third game probably is by that point. But even then, that'll be that. I really like this game, and I enjoy a lot of things about it, but unfortunately, I can't say that I loved it as much as I did the first time around. So with that being said, thank you for watching. Consider subscribing, following me on Twitter, wherever. X, my bad, X. And yeah, that's it for me, so bye.